The alkali dust tasted of grit and desperation, a fine red powder that coated everything in the Arizona Territory, including the truth. For Ada Monroe, a widow carving a life from the unforgiving soil, the truth was simple: survive another day. But on the day the sky turned blood orange with a coming storm, survival was about to take on a whole new meaning. A body not quite a corpse collapsed on her doorstep, a ghost spit out by the wind with the devil himself riding on his heels. She had a choice: bar the door and let the posse have him, or drag him inside and invite a war into her home. Her decision, made in the beat of a frightened heart, would not just shield a man's body from bullets, it would shield a nation-altering secret from the most powerful men in the West. The cabin was more of a bastion than a home. Hewn from stubborn cottonwood by her late husband, Caleb, its timbers were sealed against a land that was always trying to get in through wind dust or the bone-deep chill of a desert night. Ada Monroe knew its every groan and sigh. She knew the way the floorboards near the hearth complained when the temperature dropped, and the specific rattle of the window pane that meant a dust storm was brewing on the horizon. That evening, the rattle was a frantic shudder. The sun, a swollen, angry eye, was being swallowed by a roiling wall of red dust that stretched from one end of the desolate valley to the other. Ada secured the last of the shutters, the air already thick and tasting of metal. Her small flock of chickens was cooped, the mule stabled. There was nothing left to do but wait it out. Inside, the world shrank to the flickering halo of a single kerosene lamp. The first sound was almost lost in the rising shriek of the wind, a frantic, stumbling rhythm. Not the measured gait of a horse, but the desperate scramble of a man on his last legs. Ada froze her hand, hovering over the pot of beans simmering on the stove. No one came to this claim. It was too isolated, the spring too well hidden. Visitors were either lost or they were trouble. Then came the thud against her door. It was heavy, final, the sound of a body giving up. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Caleb's old scattergun was propped by the door, always loaded. She grabbed it, its familiar weight a cold comfort. Peering through the peephole Caleb had drilled, she saw a shape crumpled on her porch. A man, his clothes torn, one side of his duster soaked in a dark, ugly stain. Before she could think, another sound sliced through the wind's howl: hoofbeats. A lot of them. Moving, fast, organized. A posse. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her. A wounded man and a posse meant one thing: he was wanted. Turning him over was the safe thing to do, the smart thing. The sheriff in Redemption Gulch, a man named Brody, was a reasonable fellow. But there was something in the absolute stillness of the man on her porch, a surrender to the elements that snagged at her conscience. He had chosen her door to fall upon, in this empty, God-forsaken landscape that felt like a responsibility. With a curse that would have made her mother blush, Ada unbolted the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it against the cabin wall. Dust and debris swirled inside, extinguishing the lamp and plunging the room into a chaotic gloom. She wrestled with the door, her muscles straining as she grabbed the stranger's arm. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She heaved, dragging him over the threshold. Just as the first riders crested the nearby ridge, their forms silhouetted against the dying, dusty light. She slammed the door shut, ramming the bolt home. The cabin was now a tomb of swirling dust and sudden darkness. She could hear the man's breathing, a ragged, shallow gasp. She fumbled for a match, her hands shaking, and relit the lamp. The light bloomed, revealing him. He was young, maybe 25, with a face that might have been handsome before it was contorted in pain and smeared with dirt and blood. His dark hair was matted to his forehead. The wound was on his left side, a nasty tear in his flesh, just above the hip. A bullet wound clean through. He was bleeding badly. The posse was closer now. She could hear the jangle of bridles and the low murmur of men's voices. "Check the cabin," a voice barked, sharp and authoritative. It wasn't Sheriff Brody's slow drawl. This was someone else. Someone with an edge. Ada's mind raced. There was a root cellar beneath the floorboards, hidden under a bearskin rug. It was cramped and smelled of earth and potatoes, but it was the only chance. She grabbed the man's shoulders. Mister, you hear me?" she whispered fiercely. "You need to get up. You need to help me." His eyes fluttered open. They were a startling clear blue, now clouded with pain. "Just leave me." He rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Not a chance," she grunted, leveraging all her strength. "You die on my porch. You die on my terms. Now move." The raw command in her voice seemed to pierce his delirium. He gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping his lips, and managed to push himself up slightly. It was just enough. She half-dragged, half-carried him to the rug, pulling it aside to reveal the heavy trap-door. She lifted it, the smell of damp earth washing over them. "In." Now she ordered. He practically fell into the dark space. She tossed a spare blanket and a canteen of water down after him before quietly lowering the heavy door. She kicked the bearskin rug back into place, scattering some loose dirt around its edges to make it look undisturbed. A heavy fist pounded on her door. "Mom, this is the law. Open up." Ada took a deep breath, wiped the sweat and dirt from her face with the back of her hand, and smoothed her apron. She picked up the scattergun, holding it loosely, not as a threat, but as a statement. A woman alone had a right to be cautious. She walked to the door, her face a mask of weary annoyance, and slid the bolt back. The man standing there was not a lawman she recognized. He was tall and lean, with a face like a hawk and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a city suit under a long duster, and the badge pinned to his vest wasn't a sheriff's star. It was the emblem of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. "Ma'am," he said, his voice polite, but with no warmth. "Bartholomew Shaw. Apologies for the intrusion. We're tracking a fugitive." "Seen anyone pass this way?" Ada leaned against the door frame, the scattergun held loosely in the crook of her arm. "Just the wind, Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice flat. "And it's a mean-tempered guest. You and your men are welcome to water your horses at my spring, but then I'd ask you to be on your way. Storm's getting worse." Shaw's eyes swept past her, scrutinizing every dark corner of her small cabin. They were intelligent eyes, missing nothing. He was looking for signs of a second person, for a drop of blood, for anything out of place. Ada felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, praying the swirling dust had hidden her frantic tracks. "The man we're after is wounded." Shot Shaw stated, his gaze locking onto hers. "He's a murderer and a thief. Name's Jed. There's a $5,000 reward." $5,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering like a heat haze. It was enough money to leave this hard scrabble life forever. Enough to buy a ticket to anywhere. Ada met his gaze without flinching. $5,000 can't buy a man back from a dust storm, she replied evenly. If he came through here, the coyotes have got him by now. Now about that water, Shaw held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Much obliged, ma'am." As he turned away to shout orders to his men, Ada quietly closed the door, her back pressing against the rough wood, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the silence of the cabin. Below her feet, hidden by a rug and a prayer, the $5,000 secret was bleeding onto her cellar floor. The storm raged for 2 days, a relentless siege of wind and sand that turned the world outside into a howling, sightless void. For Ada, The cabin became a pressure cooker of fear and secrecy. The posse led by the unnervingly perceptive Bartholomew Shaw had made a rough camp near her spring, trapped by the same storm that was hiding their quarry. Their proximity was a constant gnawing threat. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled sound from below sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Down in the cellar, the stranger, the man Shaw called Jed, drifted in and out of consciousness. The bullet had passed through, which was a mercy, but the wound was festering. In the brief, stolen moments, she could slip down to tend to him. The lamplight revealed a feverish flush on his cheeks and a sheen of sweat on his brow. The air in the small space was thick with the smell of damp earth and infection. She cleaned the wound as best she could with whiskey and boiled water, packing it with a poultice of yarrow she kept for treating the mule. He barely registered her presence, his mind lost in a fever dream. He would mutter broken phrases, words that made no sense to her. The trestle at Scorpion Creek. Not strong enough. Kane. He wouldn't listen. The ledger. Finn. The names meant nothing. They were just the ramblings of a dying man. Yet she found herself listening, trying to piece together the fragments. He didn't sound like a common thief. On the second night, the fever broke. She was changing his dressing when his eyes suddenly focused on her, the delirium replaced by a lucid exhaustion. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Haven't saved you yet." She countered, her tone clipped to hide her relief. "The Pinkertons are camped on my doorstep, waiting for the weather to clear." He tried to sit up, hissing in pain. "Pinkerton's not a sheriff." "A man named Shaw seems awfully determined to find you." She tightened the bandage. "He says you're a murderer." The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "He's a liar, or he's working for one." He slumped back against the cellar wall. "My name is Jedediah." He called you Jed. "Close enough," Jedediah said with a ghost of a smile. He looked around the small, dark space. "Thank you, Mom. You've taken a hell of a risk for a man you don't know." "I'm starting to think I'm a fool," she admitted, her voice low. But leaving a man to be torn apart by the wind or a posse, it didn't sit right. She paused, the question burning on her tongue. "Who's Finn?" His expression clouded over. "A friend? A good man." "He's the one they killed. Shaw said you killed him." "What I am," Jedediah said, his voice gaining a hard, bitter edge, "is the man who was supposed to die with him." Before she could press him further, a sharp knock echoed from above. It was Shaw. Ada's blood ran cold. She quickly doused the small lantern she'd brought down, plunging them into absolute blackness. Not a sound she breathed before climbing the ladder and carefully replacing the trap door and rug. She opened the cabin door to find Shaw standing there, his duster dusted with a fine layer of red silt. The wind had lessened, but it still moaned around the corners of the cabin. "Mom," he began, his tone deceptively casual. "My men and I are running low on coffee. I was wondering if we might impose upon you to buy a pound of your stock. We'd pay handsomely, of course." It was a test, a pretext to get inside again, to look around, now that the dust had settled. "I sell my supplies in town, Mr. Shaw, not from my porch," Ada said coolly. "But seeing as you're stuck here, I suppose I can spare some." She turned, leaving the door open, a calculated risk. She moved deliberately, slowly scooping coffee beans into a small cloth sack. She was intensely aware of Shaw stepping just inside the doorway, his eyes once again scanning her home. He was looking at the floor, specifically at the bearskin rug. "That's a fine rug, Mom," he commented. "It was a gift from my husband," she replied, not turning around. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. He shot the bear himself not 2 miles from here. A brave man, Shaw said. His voice was closer now. He had taken another step into the room. It's a dangerous place to live alone. I'm not afraid of bears, Mr. Shaw. Living or dead. She finished tying the sack and turned to face him, forcing a calm she did not feel. She held out the coffee. His eyes flicked from her face, down to the rug, then back. For a terrifying second, she thought he would stride over and tear it from the floor. He saw something. A loose piece of dirt. Was the trapdoor not perfectly flush, but then he simply took the sack, his fingers brushing hers. He pulled a silver dollar from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. My thanks, Mrs. Monroe. We'll be moving out at first light now that the storm's breaking. He tipped his hat and was gone. Ada bolted the door, her knees feeling weak. She stood in the center of the room, listening until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. She had passed the test for now, but Shaw's parting words echoed in her mind. Mrs. Monroe. He knew her name. He had been asking questions. He wasn't just a detective on a manhunt. He was an investigator, building a case, and she was now a part of it. Down below, Jedediah had heard it all. When she opened the trap door again, his face was grim. He knows, Jedediah said. It wasn't a question. He suspects she corrected, though she didn't believe it herself. It doesn't matter. Like he said, they're leaving at dawn. He won't go far, Jedediah countered. He'll circle back, or he'll leave a man behind to watch this place. His kind are patient. He looked at her, then his clear blue eyes searching her face. You need to know who you're hiding. You need to know what you're up against. He took a ragged breath. My full name is Jedediah Dalton Harrington. The name meant nothing to her. Dalton was common enough, Harrington too, and my father, he continued, his voice dropping, is Cornelius K. Harrington, president and majority owner of the Union Pacific and Western Rail. The world tilted. Cornelius Harrington wasn't just a railroad tycoon. He was a king, an empire builder whose name was synonymous with ruthless power and limitless wealth. His railroad was the Iron Serpent, carving its way across the West, devouring land, crushing opposition, and changing the face of the nation. Ada herself had felt its shadow. The UP&W had sent surveyors near her, claim their interest in her spring, a poorly kept secret. This changed everything. The man in her cellar wasn't some common outlaw. He was a prince of the modern age, the heir to an industrial throne, and a $5,000 bounty was nothing to a man like Cornelius Harrington. It was pocket change. The Pinkertons hadn't been hired to bring Jedediah back alive for a reward. They had been hired to bury a scandal, and now she was standing right on top of it. With the dawn came a fragile, washed-out light. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and the landscape raw as if a layer of skin had been scoured from the earth. Just as Shaw had promised, the Pinkertons broke camp. Ada watched from her window as they mounted up 12 grim-faced men and rode west, away from her claim. But Jedediah's warning clung to her like the morning chill. Shaw was not a man to give up so easily. With the immediate threat gone, a new, more complicated tension settled into the cabin. Jedediah was strong enough to move from the cellar to the small cot in the corner of the room. His presence filled the space, a constant reminder of the world-altering trouble she had invited over her threshold. As he slowly regained his strength, he told her the full story. He spoke not with the arrogance of a tycoon's son, but with the weary bitterness of a man who had seen the ugly machinery behind the curtain of progress. He had been working as a route inspector for his father's railroad, a position he'd taken to learn the business from the ground up. He'd been stationed in Arizona, overseeing the new spur line being pushed south towards the Mexican border. His father's right-hand man, a ruthlessly ambitious executive named Silas Kane, was in charge of the entire western expansion. Kane cuts corners to fatten his own pockets. Jedediah explained, his voice low and intense, as he sat at a small wooden table. He buys cheaper steel, uses fewer rail ties than specified, and pays off inspectors to look the other way. The manifests say one thing, but the materials delivered are another. His friend Finn O'Connell was the lead engineer on the project. Finn was a brilliant, meticulous man who had discovered the discrepancies. He found that a critical trestle bridge being built over Scorpion Creek was structurally unsound due to Kane's cost-cutting. It was designed to carry heavy freight, but Finn's calculations showed it would collapse within a year, likely taking a train and its crew with it. Finn compiled a ledger. Jedediah said, his gaze distant. He documented everything. The fraudulent supply orders, the falsified inspection reports, the telegrams from Kane, pressuring him to speed up construction. It was irrefutable proof. Their plan was to take the ledger directly to Cornelius Harrington in San Francisco, bypassing Kane entirely. They believed the old Tycoon, for all his ruthlessness, would never knowingly endanger his own lines or his reputation. They arranged a secret meeting, but Kane must have found out. He set a trap. Jedediah's voice cracked. We were ambushed on our way to the telegraph office. They weren't trying to rob us. They were there to kill us and get that ledger. Finn, he died right there. He pushed the ledger into my hands and told me to run. Jedediah was shot as he fled, but he managed to get away. Knowing the posse would be on him, he'd wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and hidden it deep inside a hollowed-out log at a landmark they called Split Rock, a few miles from Ada's claim. He'd been trying to put distance between himself and the hiding spot when he finally collapsed. So the Pinkertons, Ada said, connecting the pieces, they aren't working for the law. They're working for Silas Kane. Bought and paid for, Jedediah confirmed. Shaw's mission isn't to bring me to trial. It's to find that ledger and put me in the ground. My father, he probably believes Kane's version of the story, that I was skimming money with Finn, that we had a falling out, and I killed him. It's the perfect lie. It removes me as his heir and covers up Kane's treason against the company. Ada was quiet for a long time, stirring the stew on the fire. It was a fantastic story, the kind you read in dime novels. A story of corporate espionage, murder, and a framed heir. Part of her, the cautious, cynical part that had been honed by hardship, screamed that it was all a fabrication, a clever tale spun by a common killer to win her sympathy. But then she looked at him. The pain in his eyes when he spoke of his friend Finn felt real. The weary disgust in his voice when he spoke of Kane's corruption felt genuine. He didn't carry himself like an outlaw. He carried himself like a man who had lost everything. Why should I believe you? She asked, her voice softer than she intended. Your father's railroad is a plague on this land. It pushes people like me off their claims. It tears up the earth and cares for nothing but profit. Why should I help the son of Cornelius Harrington? Her own words brought a fresh sting of reality. For months, men from the UP&W had been visiting her, first with polite offers to buy her land, then with veiled threats. They wanted the water from her spring for their steam engines. They told her the new spur line was coming right through her valley, and her claim was in the way. Resisting them was the reason Caleb had worked himself into an early grave, trying to prove the claim was viable. Helping Jedediah felt like a betrayal of her own fight. He met her gaze, his expression somber. You're right to hate the railroad, he said quietly. I've seen what it does. I've seen how men like Kane operate. That's why I had to stop him. Because my father built that company with vision, good or bad. Kane is turning it into a monument of greed built on cheap steel and dead men. I'm not asking you to help the son of a tycoon. I'm asking you to help me stop a man who will get dozens of innocent workers killed when that trestle collapses." He paused, his stare unwavering. "And because if you don't, Shaw will eventually find me. And when he does, he'll kill you too, just for pouring me a glass of water. You're a loose end now, Mrs. Munro. The only way out for both of us is forward." His logic was as inescapable as the barren landscape outside her door. She was in this whether she liked it or not. Hiding him had made her an accomplice. The moment she dragged him inside, his war had become hers. Her quiet life of survival had ended. What lay ahead was a fight not just for his life and his name, but for her own. Bartholomew Shaw was not a man who trusted his gut. He was a man who trusted evidence, and the absence of it was, in itself, a form of evidence. The woman Ada Munro was too calm, too self-possessed. A lone widow, confronted by a dozen armed men in the middle of a storm, should have been frightened, or at the very least, flustered. Her coolness was a red flag. Instead of riding on to the next territory, Shaw led his men to the dusty, sun-baked town of Redemption Gulch, a settlement that owed its meager existence to a nearby silver mine and the promise of the coming railroad. He set up his base of operations in the town's only hotel, a 2-story fire trap with a saloon on the ground floor. From there he began to weave his web. His first visit was to the U.S. Marshal's office, where Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut was considerably larger than his ambition, sat with his boots on his desk. Shaw presented his Pinkerton credentials and the warrant for Jedediah, which had been officially sworn by a judge in Kane's pocket. "Goes by Jed, wanted for the murder of a railroad engineer, Finn O'Connell Shaw," explained, omitting the details of who precisely had hired him. "He was wounded heading this way. We tracked him to the edge of the storm." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably. "A UP&W matter. That's big trouble, Mr. Shaw, which is why I'm sure you'll offer your full cooperation," Shaw said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I want a man posted on the West Road, another on the East, and I want to know if anyone comes into town for unusual supplies. Bandages, laudanum, anything of the sort." Next, Shaw visited the telegraph office. The operator, a twitchy young man named Peterson, was already on Silas Kane's payroll. Kane was a meticulous planner. "Any messages for me?" Shaw asked. Peterson handed him a slip of paper. The telegram was from Kane himself. "No word from H. Believes Heir is dead. Pressure mounting. Locate asset. Eliminate all liabilities. Urgent." Shaw crumpled the paper. H was Cornelius Harrington. So the old man still didn't know the truth. Kane was playing a dangerous game, lying to his boss while trying to clean up his own mess. The phrase "eliminate all liabilities" was chillingly clear. It didn't just mean Jedediah. It meant anyone who helped him. It meant the widow Ada Munro. Shaw's investigation turned to the woman herself. In the saloon over a glass of warm whiskey, he learned what he needed to know. The bartender, a gossip named Gus, told him about the Munros. Caleb, a stubborn man who died of pneumonia the previous winter. Ada, a tough private woman who kept to herself. And most importantly, the ongoing dispute with the railroad. "The UP&W wants her land. Bad," Gus said, wiping down the bar. "That spring of hers is the only reliable water for 20 miles. They need it for the new spur line. Offered her a fair price, I heard, but she won't sell. Says the land is all she has left of her husband." This was the piece Shaw had been missing. It was the lever he could use. Ada Munro wasn't just a random stranger who had stumbled into this affair. She had a motive to defy the railroad. Harboring the son of its president, the one man who could expose its corruption, was a powerful form of revenge. Her defiance wasn't just compassion, It was war. He dispatched one of his best trackers, a quiet Apache man named Cale, to set up a discreet observation post on the ridge overlooking the Monroe claim. "I don't want them to see you," Shaw instructed. "Just watch. I want to know everything. How many times she leaves the cabin, if she sets out more food than one person needs, if the smoke from her chimney ever looks like a signal. I want to know if she's hiding a ghost." Back at the cabin, an uneasy domesticity had taken hold. Jedediah was healing the wound, closing cleanly thanks to Ada's diligent care. He was able to walk now, albeit with a limp. He helped with chores, chopping wood and hauling water, his movements still stiff with pain. They talked, sharing stories of their past lives, two people from different worlds finding a strange common ground in their shared peril. Ada found herself watching him. He was not the soft city boy she might have imagined. His hands were calloused, and he knew his way around an axe. He spoke of his father with a complex mix of resentment and duty. He spoke of the future not with the entitlement of an heir, but with the uncertainty of a fugitive. One afternoon, Ada rode her mule towards Redemption Gulch for supplies. It was a necessary risk. They were low on flour and salt, and her presence in town was needed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. "Be careful," Jedediah said as she mounted up. "Shaw is a spider. He'll be watching." His warning proved prophetic. As she tethered her mule outside the general store, she saw Sheriff Brody talking to one of Shaw's men. The man was watching her. Inside the store, the owner, Mr. Abernathy, who had always been friendly, was suddenly curt and nervous. "Just the flour and the salt today, Mrs. Monroe," he asked, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "And a bottle of carbolic acid," she added, thinking of Jedediah's wound. Abernathy froze for a fraction of a second. "Acid what for?" "Cleaning drains," she lied smoothly. The storm backed everything up. He packaged her goods in silence. As she left, she saw him look towards the hotel where Shaw was staying. The web was tightening. Everyone in town was being watched, or worse, enlisted. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Redemption. Gulch was no longer a place of refuge. It was an outpost of the enemy. On the ride back, she took a longer, more circuitous route, her eyes scanning the ridges around her. She saw nothing, but she felt it. The weight of unseen eyes, the feeling of being hunted. When she returned to the cabin, Jedediah was waiting, his face taut with worry. "They know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as she slid off the mule. "They don't have proof, but they know you're here. The whole town is watching me." Jedediah nodded grimly. "Then we're running out of time. We can't wait for me to heal completely. We have to go for the ledger. Tonight?" The decision hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Staying put meant waiting for Shaw to finally close his fist around them. Leaving meant running wounded into a wilderness patrolled by a dozen hired guns. Both options felt like a death sentence, but only one offered a sliver of a chance. Only one allowed them to fight back. "Where is this split rock?" she asked. "About 5 miles northeast," he replied. "It's a dangerous ride in the dark, but it's our only hope. That ledger is the only thing that can prove my story. It's the only thing that can burn Silas Kane to the ground." Ada looked around at the small, sturdy cabin, the only home she had left. She had shielded a stranger from a posse, and in doing so, had marked her own home for destruction. There was no going back. The shadow of the railroad had finally fallen over her completely. Night fell like a black velvet shroud, moonless and suffocating. The stars, usually a brilliant spray across the desert sky, were obscured by a high, thin layer of cloud, a mercy they couldn't have prayed for. Silence in the Devil's Garden, as the old-timers called this stretch of badlands, was never truly silent. It was a tapestry of small, furtive sounds, the scuttling of a scorpion, the distant, lonely call of a coyote, the sigh of the wind through skeletal ocotillo branches. Jedediah, dressed in some of Caleb's old worn clothes, moved with a pained stiffness. Ada had packed 2 saddlebags with the essentials, a little food, 2 full canteens, and every cartridge she owned for her Winchester and Caleb's Colt revolver, which now rested on Jedediah's hip. "The mule is quiet, but not fast," Ada said, cinching the saddle on her mare, Daisy. "We stick together. If we get separated, we're done for." "We won't get separated." Jedediah vowed, his hand resting on Daisy's neck, his face a grim mask in the faint light spilling from the cabin door. They left the lamp burning inside a small deception to make Cale, the unseen watcher on the ridge, believe they were settling in for the night. They led the animals away from the cabin on foot, walking them over rocky ground where they would leave no tracks, their path illuminated only by instinct and Jedediah's memory. The ride was a tense, nerve-shredding ordeal. Every rustle in the sagebrush sounded like a Pinkerton's footstep. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the form of a waiting gunman. Jedediah rode hunched over the jarring motion of the horse, sending jolts of fire through his side. Ada rode with the Winchester, resting across her lap, her senses strained to their breaking point, her eyes scanning the oppressive darkness. They communicated in whispers and hand signals. Jedediah led them on a winding path, through arroyos and canyons, a route that would be invisible from the ridge where Shaw's man was watching. He knew this land from his time surveying for the railroad, a bitter irony that was now their only advantage. After 2 hours he reined in his horse. "We're close," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Split Rock is just beyond that rise. It's a granite outcrop, looks like it was cleaved in 2 by a giant's axe." They dismounted, tying the horses to a gnarled mesquite tree. The final approach had to be on foot. As they crested the rise, they saw it, a jagged silhouette against the slightly less black sky. Split Rock. A sense of triumphant relief washed over Ada, but it was short-lived. As they drew closer, a twig snapped in the darkness to their left. They both froze. Jedediah drew the Colt, the metallic snick of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. They stood back to back, straining to hear to see. The wind moaned through the fissure in the great rock. Nothing. Maybe just an animal, Ada breathed, her heart hammering. Maybe Jedediah whispered back, unconvinced. They moved forward again, more slowly now, their steps measured and silent. The hiding place was on the far side of the rock, a fallen, long-dead ironwood tree, its trunk weathered and grey. Jedediah knelt beside it, his hand searching for the loose piece of bark that covered the hollow. He found it and pulled. Inside the dark recess, his fingers brushed against the familiar shape of the oilcloth-wrapped package. He had it. A wave of relief so potent it almost made him dizzy washed over him. He pulled the ledger out, and then the world exploded in a flash of orange and a deafening roar. A rifle shot. The bullet splintered the rock inches from Jedediah's head, spraying them with granite shards. A second shot kicked up dirt at Ada's feet. They were ambushed. "Go get to the horses!" Jedediah yelled, shoving the ledger into Ada's hands and firing the Colt into the darkness from where the shots had come. Ada didn't hesitate. She scrambled back the way they came, clutching the precious ledger to her chest. Another shot rang out, and she heard Jedediah cry out in pain. She turned horrified to see him stumble and fall, clutching his leg. Panic seized her, but it was swiftly followed by a cold, clarifying rage. She was not leaving him. She laid the ledger carefully at the base of a rock, dropped to one knee, brought the Winchester to her shoulder, and fired at the muzzle flash. There was a satisfying yelp of pain from the darkness. Ada go, Jedediah yelled, trying to drag himself towards cover, but now there were more flashes from 2 different positions. Shaw hadn't just sent one man. He'd anticipated this. He'd laid a trap. Kyle the tracker must have seen them leave and signaled the others. Ada fired again and again, the rhythmic crack of the Winchester, a defiant answer to the ambush. She was a good shot. Caleb had taught her to hunt. She wasn't aiming to kill, just to keep their heads down, to buy time. Under the cover of her fire, Jedediah dragged his newly wounded leg behind the relative safety of the main rock. Ada scrambled to join him, grabbing the ledger on her way. They were pinned down. Their horses, spooked by the gunfire, had likely bolted. They were miles from the cabin, wounded with a shrinking supply of ammunition and a closing ring of professional manhunters. "You're hit," Ada said, tearing a strip of cloth from her shirt to press against the bleeding gash on his thigh. It was another through and through, but he was losing blood fast. Just a scratch, he lied, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He reloaded the Colt, his hands steady despite the pain. That was a mistake. They shouldn't have split up. Gives us a chance. A chance to do what Ada asked, her voice tight with fear. Die here instead of at the cabin. A chance to fight, he said, his eyes glinting in the dark. You get that ledger out of here, Ada. That's all that matters. We both get out of here, she corrected him fiercely. Or neither of us do. A voice cut through the night, calm and authoritative. It was Shaw. Harrington, it's over. The woman can go. I have no quarrel with her. Just give me the ledger, and I'll even send a doctor for you. It was the classic liar's gambit, a tempting offer of mercy from a man who possessed none. He's lying, Ada whispered. I know, Jedediah whispered back. He looked at her, his face etched with desperation and a dawning, terrible resolution. But maybe part of it is true. Maybe he would let you go. Before she could protest, he shoved the ledger back into her hands. There's an old wash that runs south from this rock, he said, his words coming in a rush. It'll give you cover for a 1/4 mile. If you run now while I keep them busy, you can make it. He was offering to sacrifice himself, to be the bait in the trap so she could escape. In the violent, chaotic dark of the Devil's Garden, surrounded by unseen enemies, Ada looked at the wounded Heir and the explosive truth in her hands, and knew that the cost of her compassion was still being tallied, and the final price might be his life. No, Ada said, her voice a low, fierce whisper that cut through the tension. I'm not leaving you to die. Jedediah stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and admiration in his pain-filled eyes. Ada, this isn't a discussion. This is survival. Yours. It's my survival, too, she shot back, reloading the Winchester with practiced, steady hands. You think Shaw will just let the witness walk away? My life ended the second I dragged you over my doorstep. We get out of this together. A plan, desperate and half-mad, began to form in her mind. It was born of a hunter's instinct and a homesteader's knowledge of the land. They're spread out, she reasoned, her voice barely audible over the wind. They think they have us boxed in, but that's their weakness. They're expecting us to cower or make a run for it. We do the one thing they won't expect. We attack. Before Jedediah could argue, she laid out the insane logic. They would split up. He would lay down, covering fire from their current position, drawing their attention. She, knowing the terrain would circle around through a series of shallow ravines she'd spotted on the ride over. She would come at them from their flank, from the darkness they thought was empty. It's suicide, Jedediah hissed. Staying here is suicide, she countered. She stuffed the oilcloth-wrapped ledger deep inside her shirt. Give me 10 minutes, then make some noise. Without waiting for a reply, she slipped away, melting into the shadows like a ghost. The darkness was absolute. She moved by, feel her hands brushing against creosote and sharp-edged rock, her feet finding purchase on the loose scree. Every step was a risk, but fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She could hear the quiet murmur of Shaw's men as they tightened their cordon, confident their prey was trapped. Jedediah watched her go, a knot of terror and awe in his chest. This woman, this solitary widow from the middle of nowhere, possessed a core of iron he had rarely seen in any man. He counted the seconds, his heart pounding in time. When he judged 10 minutes had passed, he took a deep breath, aimed high over the rocks, and emptied the Colt revolver in a deafening series of 6 quick shots. As predicted, the Pinkertons returned fire immediately, a volley of lead spanging off the granite around him. "He's getting desperate," one of them shouted. That was the signal. From the flank, the Winchester roared to life. Ada's first shot was aimed not at a man, but at a lantern one of them had foolishly lit. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil, plunging their position into confusion. Her second shot struck the rock near another man's head, sending him scrambling for cover. Panic erupted among the ambushers. They were being hit from 2 directions. Their perfect trap had been turned on them. "Where is she?" Shaw's voice bellowed in the dark. "Kyle, find her." Under the cover of the chaos, Jedediah began to move, half crawling, half dragging his wounded leg from behind split rock, towards the rendezvous point. They'd agreed upon a small, dark cave in the side of a bluff 100 yards away. Ada kept firing, moving between positions, making it sound like there was more than one person on their flank. The hunters had become the hunted. One of the Pinkertons made a break for it, trying to get a better angle, and ran right into Ada's path. She didn't shoot. She swung the heavy stock of the Winchester like a club, catching him square in the jaw. He went down without a sound. She relieved him of his pistol and cartridge belt before disappearing back into the night. The firefight was short and brutal. Outmaneuvered and unnerved, Shaw's men were disorganized. Kyle, the skilled tracker, was methodically trying to close in on Ada's position, but she was a phantom, firing once, and then moving 50 feet before firing again. Realizing his advantage was lost, Shaw made a decision. "Fall back," he commanded. "Back to the horses, we'll get them on the open ground." The remaining Pinkertons retreated, firing wildly into the darkness as they went. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the night. A tense silence descended once more on the Devil's Garden. Ada found Jedediah slumped at the mouth of the small cave, his face ashen. He was losing a dangerous amount of blood. "We did it," he breathed, a weak smile touching his lips. "We're not done yet," she said grimly. They had won the skirmish, but Shaw was still out there. They had no horses, no water, and Jedediah was fading fast. "We can't go back to the cabin. We have to get to Redemption Gulch. The town is Shaw's," he protested. "It's also our only chance," she insisted. "There's a doctor there, and Shaw won't risk a bloodbath in the middle of town. He needs to maintain the illusion of law. That's his weakness." The journey to Redemption Gulch was a waking nightmare. Ada practically carried Jedediah, his arm slung over her shoulder, his feet dragging in the dust. They moved in short, agonizing bursts, resting in the shadows. Dawn was breaking as they reached the outskirts of the town, painting the dusty street in hues of pale pink and grey. They stumbled towards the office of Doc Peterson, an elderly whiskey-soaked physician who had treated Caleb in his final days. They burst through his door just as he was lighting his morning stove. "Ada, what in God's name?" The old man began, his eyes widening at the sight of the blood-soaked man she was holding up. "He's been shot twice," Ada said, her voice strained. "You help him, and you don't say a word to anyone." As the doctor, his professional instincts overcoming his fear, went to work, Ada stood watch at the window. It wasn't long before Shaw and his men rode back into town, their faces grim with failure. Shaw's cold eyes swept the street, and Ada knew he was looking for them. He would start searching house by house. The confrontation was inevitable. It wouldn't be in the dark wilderness, but here, in the heart of the town. Jedediah, delirious with pain on the doctor's table, grabbed her arm. "The ledger," he rasped. "The telegraph office. Peterson the operator. He's on Kane's payroll, but the main line, it goes through to the U.S. Marshal in Prescott first, before it gets rerouted. You can send a message." It was a desperate, fever-induced idea, a public cry for help. Leaving Jedediah in the doctor's care, Ada slipped out the back. The ledger was a lump against her ribs. She moved through the alleyways, her heart pounding. The telegraph office was at the end of the main street near the hotel. She could see one of Shaw's men standing guard outside. There was only one way. She walked out onto the main street, the Winchester held at her side. Heads turned. The townspeople, sensing the coming storm, began to drift back into their homes and shops. Shaw emerged from the hotel, his face a thundercloud. He saw her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. He thought she was surrendering. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, striding towards her, "you've caused me a great deal of trouble." "The trouble's just getting started," Ada said, her voice carrying in the quiet morning air. She raised the rifle, not at Shaw, but at the bell tower of the town's small, dilapidated church. She fired. The bell rang out, a loud, jarring clang that echoed through the valley. It was a sound not heard in years. It was an alarm, a call to witness. Doors opened. The townspeople, including Sheriff Brody, peered out. They saw the lone woman facing down the Pinkerton agent. "This is railroad business," Shaw snarled, his composure cracking. "Go back inside." Ada fired again. The bell tolled once more. "This is about murder," she shouted, her voice ringing with conviction. "Silas Kane of the UP&W murdered an engineer named Finn O'Connell to cover up a fraud that's going to kill dozens of men. And Jedediah Harrington has the proof." She pulled the ledger from her shirt and held it high. "This is the proof, and Mr. Shaw was sent to bury it, along with anyone who saw it." Shaw's face went white with fury. His mask of civility was gone. He drew his pistol. "Give it to me." "You want it?" Ada yelled, backing slowly towards the telegraph office. "You'll have to come and get it in front of all these good people." It was the ultimate gamble. She was betting that Shaw, a man who operated in the shadows, would not commit cold-blooded murder in front of an entire town. She was betting on the conscience of men like Sheriff Brody, who had been content to look the other way. For a long moment, nobody moved. The fate of everything, the ledger, Jedediah, Ada herself, hung in the balance, waiting on the pull of a trigger in the dusty main street of a town called Redemption. The echo of the church bell hung in the dead still air, a sound of judgment. Every eye in Redemption Gulch was fixed on the standoff. Bartholomew Shaw's face was a mask of fury, his pistol aimed at Ada, but his real enemy was the crowd of witnesses she had summoned. "This is railroad business," he snarled. "It's murder." Ada's voice rang out clear and steady. "And this ledger is the proof." Seeing his authority crumble, Sheriff Brody finally found his spine. He stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "This is my town, Shaw, and in my town we don't shoot women in the street." A few townsmen, emboldened, stepped up behind him. The hunter was caged. Seeing his moment of hesitation, Ada backed swiftly into the telegraph office. "Send this," she commanded the terrified operator, slapping the ledger on his desk, "to the U.S. Marshal in Prescott. Now." As the frantic clicking of the telegraph key filled the room, The truth was sent racing down the wire. The arrival of justice was swift. By afternoon, a dozen U.S. Marshals rode into town, arresting Shaw and his men without a fight. They were followed by a special train carrying a single, imposing passenger, Cornelius K. Harrington. The final reckoning took place in the quiet of Doc Peterson's office, the air thick with the smell of carbolic acid. Cornelius stood over his wounded son, his face an unreadable granite slab. Silas Kane has confessed. The Tycoon announced, his voice void of emotion. He betrayed the railroad. He will be dealt with. He turned his gaze to Ada. You have my gratitude, Mrs. Monroe. Name your price. Ada met his powerful stare without flinching. My price is the deed to my land free and clear with water rights guaranteed, and your railroad will find a new route around my valley. A flicker of surprise crossed Harrington's face before he gave a curt nod. Done. He looked back to his son. Jedediah, when you are well, your place in San Francisco is waiting. From the cot, Jedediah slowly shook his head. No, father, he said, his voice weak but firm as he glanced towards Ada. I'm not interested in your empire of iron. I'm staying here. The great Cornelius Harrington stared at the son he no longer understood, a man who would trade a kingdom for a patch of desert dirt and the company of a stubborn woman. Without another word, the Tycoon turned and left a king returning to an empty throne. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the valley, Ada and Jedediah stood on the porch of the small cabin. The future was as vast and uncertain as the land before them, but for the first time, it was a future they would build together, not on a foundation of steel and greed, but of something far stronger. And so, in the heart of the unforgiving West, a story that could have ended in a shallow, unmarked grave found its conclusion not in riches or revenge, but in redemption. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest acts of courage don't come from the barrel of a gun, but from a simple choice to open a door to a stranger, to shield the vulnerable and to stand for the truth even when the most powerful forces in the world want it buried. Ada Monroe and Jedediah Harrington, two people from opposite ends of society, discovered that a real home isn't just a plot of land, but a shared bastion of integrity against a world that will always try to tear it down. What do you think was Ada's decision, bravery or foolishness? What would you have done in her position? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and conviction in the Old West resonated with you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a good historical drama, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more true tales and epic stories from the pages of history. Thanks for listening.